Welcome back. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our final session, which will focus on shifting global trends and the future of governance in Africa. This session will identify and tackle key challenges to governance in Africa, particularly within the context of achieving the different continental goals outlined in the AU Agenda 2030 and the SDG Agenda, in the SDG Agenda 2030 and the AU Agenda 2063. It will examine how governance can be conceptualized to have legitimacy and meaning for both African political elites and local populations. It will examine how African citizens, African governments, and international partners can foster the ambition, initiative, and creativity required to push the continent towards its governance potential, particularly within the changing global landscape. This session will examine the relevance of sustaining peace to the transformational governance on the continent and discuss examples of what sustaining peace through governance looks like in practice. It is building on the heated debate we have had since morning, and it will be the climax and giving us a futuristic approach on how to move forward. And we have two speakers this evening. Our first speaker is Dr. Jackie Silias, who is the founder and former executive director of the Institute for Security Studies, and currently serves as the board chair of trustees and head of African Futures and Innovation program at the Pretoria office of the Institute. He is a writer. He has written extensively. He has key pieces that each of you should be able to take away and read and build on your knowledge. And he will be speaking to us basing on the work that he has done. The data collected from the Africa Futures Project to help inform understanding of the future of democracy, governance, and peace building in Africa. Welcome you to share your wealth of knowledge and to give us hope on the many issues we've been grappling with this morning. You'll have 8 minutes to give us highlights of your thoughts. You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, I am going to, I spoke to you yesterday, I think it was, on our conceptualization of governance, how we model and forecast governance using 3 dimensions: security, capacity, and inclusion. And I asked the question, is it possible to advance inclusion in the absence of security and capacity? I want to, at the end of that presentation, I briefly touched on some of the work we did on global forecasts. And I want to frame this session with some of our takeaways with regard to global futures and how governance may evolve in different alternative futures. So I go back to the website, our African Futures website, where I showed you can look at the future of every African country and every region in Africa, out with a forecast horizon out till 2043. And we spoke a little bit about the forecasting model that we use, International Futures from the University of Denver. I'm now going to go to the thematic part of the website and going to speak about how developments in the rest of the world could impact on Africa. I'm going to summarize from a very long, evolved analysis our main conclusions, seeing I have only 8 minutes. So I go to the top of that page, to our sort of slider, as we refer to it. Let me just size that. And I take you to our top 10 takeaways. So we've started off by looking at where power is going globally. You get different conceptualizations of power: soft power, hard power, discursive power, smart power. Our analysis, looking long term, is that China will probably overtake the United States as the most powerful country in the world before mid-century. So China's economy is already larger than the US economy in purchasing power parity. But when you measure power, material power, you should use market exchange rates, and at market exchange rates, the Chinese economy overtakes the US economy in about 10 years' time. However, the West will continue to dominate, because different to China, the West is a much larger alliance, and China has got problems with all its neighbors. So GDP per capita, technology, the West will continue to dominate even over an expanded BRICS Plus alliance. We modeled, in actual fact, that, and you can look at that in the text, where power goes and the differences between between population, economic size, income per capita, and so on. The second is that with the growth of the global south, the future is likely more regional rather than global. Regions are, in a sense, disconnecting from the global commons. Africa, Asia, North America, South America, and becoming more regionally integrated. So this becomes a world of complex multipolarity, but very likely with a growing divide between the rich West and the rest. We see that already. However, governments in rich liberal democracies are losing authority and power to the private sector, while the ability of autocracies to buy off the desire for self-actualization through rapid economic growth is declining. How long can China defy gravity? Will China not eventually democratize? What about the Middle East? Can you continue to pump oil and buy off your citizens their desire for self-actualization? Or at some point, do the women come home to overthrow or to challenge your authority? I think I showed you this. We looked at global futures by looking at two axes: the extent of globalization, which gives you an interconnected globalized world versus nationalist populism, versus extent of sustainability, that gives you four worlds: a sustainable world, a divided world, a world at war, and a growth world. When I spoke to you previously and showed you what else we have done, I indicated to you that this is the world that we have modeled on our website: Africa's potential in a sustainable world. These are the broad scenario descriptions of those four worlds: a sustainable world, a divided world, which is more or less where we are headed at the moment, which is a fragmented world of clubs, such as the G7 BRICS non-aligned movement, although I think the G7 Plus is really, the BRICS Plus is really replacing, in a sense, the non-aligned movement, and a retreat from a rules-based order. So in this scenario, Trump gets elected next year, and bickering between the US and the EU weakens the West, and without a global consensus on climate change, mitigation and adaptation is weakened. In this tense world, the gap between a rich West and the global South widens amidst rising xenophobia and anti-migrant sentiment. That's more or less a description of the world we are heading towards. In a sustainable world, you have global reform. You have a rules-based system, minimum corporate tax rates. In the world at war, it's a world of successive wars. The war in Russia's invasion of Ukraine becomes a war between Russia and NATO. China seizes that moment eventually to invade Taiwan. Eventually China and India bump up against one another in Asia. In the rich world, in the growth world, Elon Musk owns everything. Private sector, the rise of corporate capitalism. This is the size of the African economy versus the economies of the rest of the world in 2019 and in 2043 for our 4 scenarios. 2019, the year before COVID, so the African economy about 3.1 trillion, the economy of the rest of the world about $97 trillion, and this is the size of the global economy and the African economy in those 4 different worlds in 2043. This is carbon emissions in each of those worlds, which will have a huge impact, particularly on Africa. I'm not going to discuss that. This is a description of the African scenarios in that world, in those 4 different worlds. Basically, African integration, or the full implementation of the continental free trade area, is a decisive turning point for Africa. Without trade integration, Africa cannot grow. It's as simple as that. Without a larger market, without eventually integrating in global value chains. So in these 4 worlds, in the sustainable world, the continental free trade area is implemented, but in the other worlds it is not. In the growth world, Africa links up with other, you don't get continental integration. Regions, North Africa links up with Europe, the Horn with the Persian Gulf, Southern Central East Africa with China, West Africa with the West. Whoops. Most likely, or current sort of trajectory is a struggle with global common positions. This is the size of the African economy in those 4 different worlds. The same slide I showed you, but this is only Africa. Just to show you the different size of the African economy in each of those different worlds. How developments in the rest of the world will impact on every aspect of Africa, including on governance and peace building. This is extreme poverty in Africa in those 4 different worlds. About 36% of Africans live in extreme poverty. We can, in a best world, by 2043 get to about 5%, or 114 million people. Most likely, about 18%, 407 million Africans still living in extreme poverty by 2043 if we do not achieve those transitions that we spoke about the other day. So the war in Ukraine and the fear of China's rising influence is having significant collateral damage effects. We can discuss that, but basically Africa needs China, needs the European Union, it needs the US. It cannot and should not make a choice between them. Its development, although its developmental future will increasingly be determined by rising Asia, because that's where economic growth is coming from. Africa's foreign policy and developmental efforts should unequivocally advance geopolitical stability. You can already see the damage that global tensions are having on Africa, also on global growth. It will also impact upon governance going forward. Because what is happening is there is a retreat from those in the West that have been pushing particularly liberal democracy. And there is a resurgence of, for example, in the Sahel, about alternative models. Africa should avoid being instrumentalized, pursue sustainable growth, and actively support a next-generation rules-based system. Africa needs a rules-based system. With 55 small, relatively insignificant global economies. Remember, the total African economy is less than 3% of the global economy. Yes, we've got lots of people, but that is not a source of power or influence unless you can translate that large number of people into a working age, educated, healthy population that can drive your development. So we need a rules-based system, just not the present one. Because a rules-based system will protect us, even in a Chinese-dominated system, because you must ask yourself the question, will an authoritarian Chinese-dominated global system be better or worse than a US-dominated system? From an African perspective, the West needs to differentiate between China and Russia and resist simplistic narratives that pit a benevolent West against bad China associated with evil Russia. The Chinese Communist Party is not going to abandon its politics, its views on politics and development, while democratic countries are not going to abandon a belief in individual freedoms and political rights. We already see that trend emerging. Second last, main takeaway. So we have modeled these 4 scenarios, and you can read extensive narrative on these 4 scenarios. Now, what could disrupt them? I've already mentioned the one, democratization of China, which as GDP in China increases becomes increasingly likely, not because of external influence, but because, like every other region in the world, Chinese would like the ability to determine their own future, the future of their children. And the democratization of China will have hugely disruptive effects on the global economy and on Africa. It's our largest trading partner. Ongoing political polarization, eventually conflict in the US. Substantive expansion or contraction of the European Union. Or political integration and reorientation in Asia. Those are the 4 sort of big things that could disrupt our scenarios. Future relations between the US and the EU are hugely important. For the West, the most disastrous thing what could happen is if Trump gets elected next year, and probably for Ukraine. And India's foreign policy orientations will therefore affect the future balance of power and the nature of that power. These are our sort of recommendations. Africa needs political stability. The period when Africa was the most unstable was in the years just before the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Because stability in Europe and North America pushed conflict out to Africa. The danger is that the same could happen with the Chinese-US rivalry. And Africa needs to resist being instrumentalized, whether that is on Taiwan or Ukraine. We have a dog in the fight, our development. We need global stability. But we need to be able to make our own choices and not to be forced into camps where we are punished for that. We need to relentlessly pursue our developmental interests. That includes conditions for foreign investment, like China did, knowledge transfers, like China did, and domestic linkages to get knowledge transfers. We need to institute protocols on the full transparency of all government contracts, loans to state and state-owned enterprises, etc. There should be no hidden debt. There should be non-reciprocal tax information exchange mechanisms, because we are all concerned about corruption. What do Africans do with our leaders do with their corrupt monies? They store them in the United Kingdom, in Switzerland, in the United States. We need to stop that. Exchange of tax information can help. We need effective continental institutions for development. A legally binding protocol on good governance, so that it's not only a framework on the peace and security, a binding protocol, much of which has been undermined, with many of the institutions that were established on the peace and security architecture now dismantled, but we need a binding protocol on good governance. Develop continental standards on technical stuff that we can make agreements on. Like, what are the standards for railways that the Chinese, the Americans, and everybody else need to adhere to so that our railways can connect? A two-track approach to trade integration and better governance, so that those countries that can adhere to higher standards of integration and better governance can proceed more rapidly. How can you implement the continental free trade area in the Sahel or in Somalia? You can't, not effectively. So we need to think about how we proceed with the continental free trade area. And we need a financial and trade architecture fit for the 21st century that reduces the cost for sovereign borrowing and debt relief. Africa, as you know, pays about 4 times more than Europe for our borrowing and about 8 times more the United States. Yet we need more money. On our website, you will see articles written about the extent to which Africa needs more debt. We need to be able to borrow double the amounts that we borrow at the moment, and we need to pay significantly less interest on it. We need more democratic and representative decision-making in the international financial institutions so that they are more balanced in terms of and represent the people who borrow the money, so that it's not only the lenders that are represented, but that the borrowers are also on it. Massively scale up development and climate finance, including from private finance. The mountain of money, or the dam of money, is in the West, in private capital. And those are also where we owe most of our money to, not to China. And we need to find a way of unlocking Western capital, because those are the deep pockets of capital that we need to develop. And we need global tax reform, so that Google and Facebook and other companies pay tax where they have clients. So, I'm going to stop there, and that hopefully frames where I think governance also will go, and where peace and security could go, because none of us have a crystal ball. We don't know where the future is going to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for flagging out those key issues and letting us know where our position falls in terms of the growth world, in terms of the sustainable world, and also how low we fare within our trade relations. We are at the bottom. So if we are to deal with issues of poverty, issues of competition, dealing with the geopolitics, there's lots of insights that we have got from this presentation. Thank you very much. I would request that you keep your comments, write your questions. We'll receive them at the end once our next speaker concludes. I would like to invite our next speaker, Dr. Cyril Obi. Do you hear us?
Yes, loud
yes, you're
and clear.
welcome. Dr. Obi is the Program Director for the African Peacebuilding Network and the Next Generation of Social Sciences in Africa program. He brings extensive research, a wealth of knowledge in publishing around issues of peace, security, and development. And he completed his studies in political science and has studied in a number of institutions. He's one of Africa's greatest scholars. We are great to have him on this panel, and he will be sharing with us the relevance of sustainable peace to the transformational governance on the continent, and highlight examples of what sustaining peace looks like and what it means for us. You recall that when we started, these are some of the things that were flashed out in the morning. So welcome you to speak to us. You have 8 minutes to share your knowledge. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very, very much. And I would say good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I'm really very grateful to the Africa program of the Wilson Center for inviting me to share some of my thoughts with you on 2 very important issues in Africa, peace and governance. And coming after the masterly presentation by Yaki Silias, who is a good friend and somebody I have listened to regularly, my task has been both complicated and simplified at the same time. My presentation is going to be more of my own reflections on the struggles for sustainable peace and transformational governance in Africa. I deliberately try to avoid a lot of the heavy concepts and what I call technical jargons to bring my reflections to a basic level to see where Africa is in relation to these two key concepts, what we should remember, what we should think of, and the challenge ahead in the context of Agenda 2063 to the Africa that we all want and wish. Africa today is at the crossroads. It's hanging somewhere between crisis, peace, and the prospects for transformation, which admittedly may look dim when you look at the statistics and the various scenarios that are being painted about Africa's marginal position. But I would argue that even in the midst of all this, Africa cannot be dismissed and actually should be acknowledged in the realm of having opportunities and having a lot of agency. So I start by posing the question, is Africa in crisis? And I say, yes, it is. And it is a deep-seated complex crisis, both internally driven by economic inequalities and inequities, governance deficits, as well as externally driven global inequalities, struggles between hegemonic global powers, the crisis of aging global democracies witness the emergence of extreme right-wing and populist groups in some of the countries considered to be democracies in the West, and how this is beginning to destabilize policy towards Africa, as well as internal cohesiveness in those countries. And add on top of this, a slowly changing global order, including the rise of militarism amidst a global climate crisis with certain structural ramifications that have paid so far little attention to issues of justice and equity. Yet, as I argued earlier, this scenario represents challenges, but also opportunities. In setting about a critical overview of the struggle for sustainable peace and transformational governance in Africa, I will not go into definitions about the concepts of peace and governance. And this is in the interest of time. I had 8 minutes, and there's so much you can do in 8 minutes. The idea that African people are engaged in a struggle for peace already suggests that we are moving away from the terrain of mainstream analysis to critical reflections. The struggle for peace, I argue, refers to the daily struggles by ordinary people for freedom from want, poverty, and fear, and the real struggles for social justice, dignity, sustenance, and life that is free from violence, predation, and oppression. I argue that it is only under such terms and conditions that we can really refer to a sustainable peace. I speak against the background of the billions of dollars that have been spent on what I call peace imposed from above and outside, negotiated by elites, strongmen, armed factions, and various groups in the international community. There is no doubt that many African countries currently enjoy some form of peace. But the real question is, what is the quality of peace? Whose peace and at what cost? The last question also impinges on the issue of cost and sustainability. Can African people continue to bear the costs of top-down imposed peace? The historic struggles against oppression and exploitation, and the more recent upheavals and protests against long-ruling sit-tight rulers should be seen as part of the struggles for peace, driven by the quest for equality, justice, and access to the good life, which are more likely to lead to more sustainable forms of inclusive political participation, equality, social justice, and unity. The issue of transformative governance is organically linked to the quest for peace. In other words, you really cannot have sustainable peace without having a transformation in governance. Much like the crisis of peace, governance in Africa can be approached from the external and internal dimensions. Given the shifts in the post-Cold War world and a post-pandemic world order, and more recently the war in Ukraine, the world is witnessing some shifts from a US-led Western-dominated world to a more multipolar and fragmented emerging global order. With the emergence of China as a formidable economic power, the resurgence of a militarized Russia, and the emergence of new regional powers such as India, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the rise of new financial and economic blocs, for example, BRICS and BRIC Plus, all of which pose challenges and opportunities to Africa. The recently concluded meeting of the G20 in India, for example, you would see that the African Union has been invited to join that body. Some will say that it is partly a reaction to the fact that BRICS Plus is expanding and just recently announced 6 more members, with implications not just for the global distribution of power, but also for what I call the de-dollarization of the global economy, all of which have implications for Africa. You all know that African economies are largely what you call raw material exporters, most of which is denominated in US dollars. What does it mean if China's economy is growing and de-dollarization takes place? It also means that when people talk of a new scramble for Africa, it's going to even become more interesting when African countries get the opportunity to sell their raw materials in another currency apart from the US dollar. Note again that this is against the background of the fact that Africa tends to trade a lot with China. What does this mean for relations with other emerging global powers? Is this a challenge or is this an opportunity? How can Africa transform itself, not just in terms of its governance, for example, but in terms of how it governs its natural resources and natural wealth? A lot of the time, when people talk about governance, it's really about political governance. It's about democracy. It's about constitutional or constitutional changes. It's about building of political institutions. But the basics of economics, which I would argue is a basis of sustenance and sustainability in an expanded sense in the context of where Africa continues to bear the brunt of climate change, is something that we must actually seriously begin to grapple with. Much has been said about the governance deficits in Africa, and many books have been written about uh, authoritarianism, democratization, and elections in Africa. And we could argue until we are blue in the face as to why we have had so many coups in the past couple of years, including 2 in a month, one in Niger and one in Gabon. And now people are referring to the contagion of coup d'etat. Well, Africa is no stranger to coups. And it's very interesting why there seems to be so much alarm over coups. Is it actually that coups are a signal to the crisis of democracy or the failure of elections to actually engender transitions, peaceful and honest transitions? what really is a problem. Is it a crisis of institutional governance? Is it a crisis of institutional weaknesses? Is it about corruption? Tons have been written about corruption in Africa, about the corruption of African governments and African leaders. A lot has also been written about the crisis of constitutionalism and the lack of respect for the rule of law. Issues have also been raised about the weaknesses of regional economic communities. For example, what is ECOWAS doing about the coups in West Africa? What can ECAS do about the coups in Central Africa? What is the African Union doing in terms of its uneven-handed handling of coups in different parts of Africa? Some countries would have a coup and all they get is a slap on the wrist. Some countries have a coup and then all hell gets loose, but no action is really taken beyond the usual announcing of sanctions. What does this mean if you want to transform governance? How does this kind of challenge, we need to think about how we can go beyond just rhetoric to actually take steps. If institutions are weak, what do we do about them? How can we breathe life and put teeth into our resolutions, into our mechanisms? What has happened to the mechanisms that have been put in place? Why do they seem not to be working? How are coupists able to survive for so long? Well, you can even extend the argument to say there are different kinds of coups. There are those who are military coups, and there are those which are civilian coups. There are also coups against ordinary people. What can we do in terms of looking at this, what I call inequities and these structural weaknesses? Where have they come from? And who is responsible for this? Would it be too much to ask those who are responsible to think again? Or can we make it impossible for them to act in the manner that endangers their countries, their people, and indeed the entire continent? What do we do in terms of collective will and purpose to transform governance? The issue perhaps is what we have to do to move beyond reactive, stalled mechanisms and processes of reform. How can we realize the lofty goals we have set for ourselves in the African Union's Agenda 2063 so that we don't have to come back and say, oh, we have to postpone the agenda by another decade? Because the reality is that when you look at all the things that Agenda 2063 wants to achieve, yes, some of them have been achieved, but Africa is facing formidable challenges to peace and to governance. And we do have to ask ourselves hard questions. I'm not going to pretend that I have the solutions. What I can say is I can point to where the solution lies. And the solution lies when we start to ask ourselves critical and important questions. And the us have to do with the elites, the researchers, the thinkers, civil society practitioners and activists, decision makers, and the friends of Africa. And the friends of Africa, from what I heard from the previous speaker, is not just the West. It could actually be China, it could be India, it could be Saudi Arabia, it could be other countries. We have to be very strategic in terms of what we ask our friends, each friend. Indeed, we as a people, we have to re-democratize Africa on our own terms. I have always made the argument that the problem is not democracy. It's democracy for whom and on whose terms. Probably Africa will have to begin to think of re-democratization as opposed to democratization, because democracy is in crisis across the world, I would argue. It's not an African problem. It's a global problem. The kind of democracy we know, liberal democracy, is aging and it is fraying at the edges. It has to receive a shot in the arm, fresh thinking of how to connect governance to ordinary people, how to help them really achieve sustainable peace through governance is one of the critical challenges of our time. We will need to think collectively to contributing towards building sustainable peace, equitable and transformative governance. It is well within our reach, I argue, but we have to do the work. The time to change mindsets, dream big, and act fast is upon us. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much for those reflections and flagging out key issues. Issues of the fact that we need to look at our economics if we are to have a transformative governance and sustainable peace, but also to be able to connect this governance to our local and ordinary people so that it comes from within us. It's not an external seen perspective of governance and democracy. So I would like to open the space for us for comments, questions, and any further reflections. Yes, thank you. We'll start with the Prime Minister. Okay.
My comments will be directed to Yaki's presentation. I looked at the difference between the growth world and the sustainable world, the finances that you put there, 13, 15. Realistically speaking and knowing human nature, what's the probability of a growth world, of a sustained world? I think we should trade more carefully to the growth world that is mitigated by certain factors. And I'm looking at your growth world, the top right quadrant. I also use a 2x2 matrix, but on different issues. And I like its simplicity and its clarification. You're talking about low corporate taxes. I think by just saying and again, you are actually perhaps assuming, and I'm putting this in your mind, you'll be talking about trickle down, the real invested. Has it ever happened? And we know that when we talk about taxing these companies, they say, no, we won't invest. It's never happened. Even taxing the rich, it's never happened. So I tend to lean towards the right-hand side. So I see contradictions there. Can you explain this? I know perhaps one of the answers is that it's not as distinct as it is. It's a continuum. But just explain to me, maybe hazard a guess, what's the probability towards a sustainable world? Then the other issue that I think we need to talk about in a policy space, especially when you spoke about the AFCFTA. How do we move in an African, whether here about peace, how do we move from the convoy approach to a rules-based club? Because we know Africans leaders will sign. Photo moments are the best. So the question I think that we should interrogate further is, can we, looking to the ACFTA, we can start perhaps, and I'm suggesting here something that we can do, start with the most willing people. I think I was in a talk by Carlos Lopez, and he was saying distinguishing countries for the ACFTA between those who are ready and those who are not. Let those who are ready start. Let's not try and have this everybody, which is the convoy approach. Now, if 2 countries or 3 countries start and they start trading and they set their rules to enter their club, now we are moving towards a rules-based club, which is what the AU is and NAFTA and all other things are. I'd hazard me your thoughts on that. It will be very interesting. Thanks. I made quite a few notes, but I don't want to hog the talking. Today is my quiet day.
Thank you very much, presenters. I have just brief interventions. And the first one, which is very brief, is on a statement Yaki made that Africa needs US, the EU, as well as China. And I think we can rephrase it and say that whereas Africa needs US, China, and the EU, that US, China, and EU also needs Africa. If you, of course, we listened to Dr. Obi when he mentioned that there is a new scramble for Africa. And not only now, but even during the, I don't want to talk about the slave trade, and if we begin to measure who came to who first, it is because of need. So I think while they need us, or while we need them, they also need us even the more. And this takes me to a segment of your presentation that you said you don't want to talk about much. But actually, that is my own key area that I would want you to talk much about. And that was about the carbon emission. That when you came there, you say you don't want to talk about that. Let me remind us that Africa contributes only 4% of the global carbon emission. And whereas we contribute only 4% of this global emission, Africa bears the greatest burden in terms of climate change impact. And that burden is seen in our inability to adapt to the impacts of climate change, seen in droughts, seen in flooding, and overflowing of rivers and oceans and so on and so forth. And because we don't have high capacity to adapt, it becomes imperative that the issue of climate financing be actually prioritized for Africa. And I am very happy when I saw in your recommendations, you mentioned the issue of massive climate financing. I was happy. But it will be nice you dig deeper into that climate financing. Whereas we talk about trillions of dollars needed for climate financing, what we have had from 2016 to 2020 is an annual budget of about $630 billion made available for climate financing globally. But whereas Africa bears the greatest burden, Africa has only received 19.5 billion annually from this 630 billion that is available. So we don't pollute we don't pollute the environment, 4% only. And we have said, let us adopt the polluter pays principle, where those who have industrialized and polluted pay for it. And yet, Africa is not polluting, 4%. And the financing available is only moved to other continents that are not actually bearing the greatest burden of climate change impact. So this disproportionate and kind of inequality in sharing the climate finance available for the globe, 630 billion, and giving us only 19 billion, is another unfair treatment of this continent called Africa. And that's why I said, when you say you were not going to talk about it, I just felt I cringed and said, this is what we should be talking about. My comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the excellent presentations. I have two questions for Dr. Jackie. Your presentation was excellent. Since yesterday, I am taking a lot of lesson with this futuristic website or information that is this website provides about the future. My first question is, what do you plan to accomplish with the information, with this comprehensive and robust information that's available in the website? Obviously, it is of immense contribution to academic scholarship, but beyond that, what do you think is the contribution of this website to African governments? Why am I asking this? Because, I mean, if you look at the West African problem, for instance, many think tanks 1 or 2 years ago predicted that this will probably happen. I can mention a lot of briefs made at IPSS. Same prediction was about Ethiopia, about the civil war. Same prediction about Sudan, political instability in the Horn of Africa. And we can't say that governments were not aware of the looming crisis. They knew that this was coming, but they didn't change course. Will your website will it be heeded to by African governments, or you're just putting it out there? So if they like, they can use it. If they don't like, they can ignore it. That's one. The other is an interesting focus that you made in your today's presentation about the future is this China-West, China-US rivalry and how this is going to dictate the future. I personally do agree that this is a very important point of departure for the future, but also in our yesterday session, in one of our closed sessions, that we were promised by important personalities by the US State Department that the current American policy towards Africa is not informed by this rivalry. That's what they promised. I don't want to put you on the spotlight, but should we trust the present, or should we trust the future? Yeah, thank you very much.
Can I perhaps respond to these
Can we
questions?
allow him to respond to these first, then we'll take our second round?
So I'll start, I'll try and be brief about my comments. Yeah, our work has been done in collaboration with Order NEPAD, the Secretariat. We have a memorandum of understanding with them, and the intention with our work is to work with NEPAD to feed our work into the National Planning Department and the Statistical Agency of every African country. So we do about 6 or 7 countries a year. So we've done a forecast for every country in Africa, as I showed you. Now we update them, and we try, this works with some countries, with some it doesn't, through NEPAD to then engage with the National Statistic Office and the Planning Division, and to feed our analysis, firstly to ask them to comment on our work, to get the data right, because very often they have national data that is better perhaps than other data. We update the forecast, we discuss it with them, and we feed it into their system. So we are trying that our work is not purely an academic exercise. So that is very important for us, because there are many good ideas, but our problem always is the implementation. Generally, now coming to the remarks I think one of you made, while Africa's partners are important, it is our responsibility. Foreigners did not go and develop Korea, the Asian tigers, or China, or Europe. Well, they benefited a lot from slavery, colonialism. The people from those countries did it. And that's where our responsibility lies. And I make the same remark when it comes to climate financing. We can expect billions and trillions of dollars. We can have ambitions that people are going to pay us for the damage they have caused. I promise you it will not happen. I can guarantee you that it will not happen. We have to take responsibility for ourselves And once we are successful, maybe others will come and invest and help. And then let's turn to, so we have forecast every sector, literally. So let me go to thematics and look at the impact of climate change and energy. So we've done a lot of work on this. We actually, at the moment, I'm starting this weekend, we are going to update our forecast. Because you must understand, we cannot predict the future. I wish we could. So we cannot predict coup d'etats and so on and so forth. The best way we can do that is to create scenarios and to look at trends, structural trends. And structural trends are quite important. For example, my forecast would be that sub-Saharan Africa is going to get more unstable if I look at the youth bulge and I look at other factors around that. Employment creation and so on. But I want to show you one chart. So Africa is a minor producer of carbon at the moment. As always, go to the left-hand side. I look at all charts, as I showed you. This is a very important chart. This is a chart that shows carbon emissions, history and forecast. Okay, this is from 1990 with a forecast until 2063. The end of Agenda 2063. That is, of course, China. China is by far the largest carbon emitter globally at the moment. The stock of carbon emissions comes from the West, of course, through industrialization. So that is what's happening with the US. That's what's happening with the European Union, because they are rich and they have declining populations. That is India. This is so, India peaks in around 2040, around there. This is Africa. By about 2070, Africa emits more carbon than any other country or region in the world, largely a function of our growing population. So we emit very little carbon at the moment per capita. But as we grow and develop, we are going to emit significantly more carbon. And we will become a major polluter unless we invest now and adopt a carbon neutral, whatever term you want to use, transition. It is largely driven, as I've said, this trend, by our growing population and the fact that our development is very carbon intensive. Look at South Africa. We used to have electricity, now we've got generators. In any case, we need to move very rapidly towards a green transition, not only in our interests, but in the world's interest. Because if this forecast is right, then towards the end of in 30, 40 years' time, Africa becomes the major polluter in the world. We may think, yes, it's not our responsibility, but it is our responsibility. We can't divide the air. The implementation of a continental free trade area, I think, will happen from the bottom upward. I don't think the continental free trade area will happen from the top down. So I think that the regions will first integrate, and then we will see steady movement, because there are huge problems in the implementation. How are you going to move forward in North Africa, which is the region with the lowest intra-regional trade in the world at below 5%? And I can carry on with the problems in the Sahel and so on. So I think that bottom-up is probably where things are going, is probably how we're going to get to the continental free trade area. But we must get to it. Then I think you asked about the potential of implementing the potential of getting to the sustainable world. Now, when you do forecasting like this, and you use this kind of framing that I've used, those are the 4 global scenarios that I showed you. The purpose of the framing is to present, to make sure that you capture the four corners of a possible world. Reality will unfold differently. We refer to reality as the current path or the likely pathway. There is more than one direction towards the sustainable world. I would say the most likely avenue to a sustainable world is through a world at war. A crisis will drive change. I made the point that on our current trajectory, we are more or less going in that direction. But reality will always be somewhere between these scenarios. The purpose of this grid is to open up our thinking so that we can see what the possibilities are and what the implications of each is. Having said that, the possibility of getting to a sustainable world is quite limited, maybe 20% at best. Because inevitably, people will react based on crisis, on force, on being forced to change. I think I've answered all the questions. I've tried. Yes.
The follow-up I want to make is about the scenario you showed regarding the high emission that Africa will have in 2063. And I want to draw your attention to the concept of carbon leakage, where that increase in carbon emission in Africa is not caused by Africans. What is happening is that China and the US and the Europe are coming to Africa to outsource production activities that lead to these emissions and yet export back the product to their own countries or to other countries to make...
We have not modeled that.
Pardon?
What our modeling is we take each of those scenarios, sorry to interrupt, and we model the associated carbon with every of those scenarios, you know, those scenarios on industrial manufacturing, better education, continental free trade area. So I'm not, and just make the other point, sorry, I'm not sure that, for example, the European Union will allow the level of carbon leakage that you are referring to. If you look at the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Sorry, I should have not interrupted you.
Yeah, it would be nice we trace the source of the carbon emission, not only by the geographical location, but by the source, by the company that is emitting it. Because this is a virtual kind of emission, while where they still leave their countries, and geographically it will show they are having a decrease. But they have gone to another country, most of the low-income countries.
Thank you very much. I would like to request that we move to another round of questions and comments. We can proceed with that discussion in other platforms. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure whether this... Okay, it's working. Interesting. Jackie, this is very interesting. Building up from yesterday and seeing how the model works. And I would say from this panel, I'm learning that it's as if you and Cyril collaborated somehow in doing the modeling. Because Cyril has talked about the crisis of polycrisis, too many crises. And he has explained opportunities and challenges that are emerging and how Africa can take advantage of that in terms of governance so that governance is not only limited to politics, but to also resource governance and other things. And then I look at what you're projecting there. I can see the world moving into regions. You know, the African region, you know, the North American region, the Asia region. That's a likely scenario. then that means that what this tells us is that we should be able to use the local capacities that we have. That some of these capacities are driven through information technology and artificial intelligence to build scenarios that will be able to answer those questions that Cyril posed. And I think we saw a little bit of your suggestions on what you can do in your aggressive campaign in Africa to see how far we can get with that kind of intervention. And the other thing is, I think that we need to understand that data science and information systems are really essential when it comes to transforming Africa, whether you want to transform it in terms of governance and peace building and what have you. But I think this is what we call data-driven interventions. So I would want to thank you for coming up with such an innovative idea. And I think this tells us the kind of capacity we have as Africans, and it's really echoing also what the ambassador told us the other time, that we can fully take advantage of in the digital transformation for Africa agenda that the US has. That these are some of the innovations that we want to see, so that we do not only presume that we are solving the problem, but this problem is informed from data, and data that builds possible scenarios, as we've seen here in this panel from yesterday and today. So mine is to thank you very much, and also to thank my good friend Cyril Obi for his wonderful reflections on what it takes to build peace in Africa, considering Africa's interests. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Museveti, and I'm a student of international relations at the University of Pretoria. Firstly, I would like to just say thank you to the organizers of this event, and a big thank you also to the speakers, the ones that are on this panel and the ones that spoke in the previous panels. Thank you very much, particularly because what has been discussed today speaks a lot to my research, which investigates the African Union's normative policy on military coups. So this has been a very, very helpful discussion from morning up until now. Thank you very much. I do have a question which is not necessarily addressed to the panel, but rather to the organizers of this conference and the partners as well. I would like to know, because I am aware that this is an annual conference, and by that, the implication is that next year there will be another conference. My question is, between now and the next conference, what is going to be a plan of action? One of the speakers, I forgot, but it's the lady at the front. She did speak about moving from recommendations to actions. And sometimes I always think we have there's this environment of where we have nuanced conversations about the pressing challenges. But then again, afterwards, it's like we wait until the next meeting. So I'd just like to know, what is going to be the plan of action between this conference and the next year's conference? Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. I can answer that really quickly and can still have some more conversation with you afterwards. This conference is going on for an entire week. So this is the first public open session that we have. And in our closed sessions, we'll be having discussions about a plan of action on what to do moving forward, but can share some more information with you towards the end. I have two questions. And these questions are built on some of the points that, Vuyo, I heard some points that you made on Monday at the first day of our conversations about political will. And the fact that a lot of the problems or challenges that we outline, very often the solutions are clear, and how to address them are clear. But often the biggest challenge is on political will. And you had asked, is there I can't remember how you put it, whether there was an index or how do you measure political will? And I'm wondering, in your modeling, Jackie, if this is something taken into account, or if there are any systems out there that can actually help us track political will, since we know what some of these challenges are, but it's just the will to implement and to get them done. The second question too as well, Vuyo, is building on something that you said about trade, the African Continental Free Trade Area. And Jackie, you had mentioned that without trade integration, Africa cannot grow. And I think there was a point you made about the fact that as we look towards the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, we should also think about the different conflicts that might come with the implementation of this. I'm wondering if that was also factored into the exercise, the scenario, into your scenario planning, and if that's something that you can share with us today.
To all our colleagues, if you try and search on even Google Scholar, political will, the last best papers were around 2010. And it worries me. 2010, 2012, the last good papers. And people have moved from political will to kind of another science called, what do they want to call it? Policy implementation science. It has failed. So I'm just reinforcing on your point that you have raised. That that thing is lacking in everything that we are doing. And in the gap in the last good, really theoretical integration of this concept, 2010, I think by Beckenhoff or some people like that, it's quite, I just checked it right now, it's quite fascinating. That was just a point of interest. Thanks.
So let me start with this issue of political will. So if a country is lucky enough to get a governing elite that focuses on national development, they do well. Very often, at low levels of development, that is the result of a national trauma. The Rwandan genocide, the Red Terror in Ethiopia, both of those events in Africa led to a governing elite that said never again, and we will take our country forward. The same happened in China, many other countries, where a national trauma led to a process to a governing elite committed to growth. That is the alternative to what I discussed yesterday, where I said that nationalism generally in the Westphalian state precedes development. Because during the process of war makes the state and the state makes war, people decide, people become French or German or British or whatever the case may be, and they have a common unity of purpose, and their elite leads on behalf of the entire country. That is not the case in many African countries, where we have an imposed state. And it is also not the case in South Africa, where you have a government that is committed to growing a development model that is not based on that is very segmentary in its nature. But let me not go there. What we need in Africa, the situations that arise that I have mentioned, where you have a governing elite that is committed to national development, is the exception. Rwanda and Ethiopia, which are often used under Meles Zenawi and Paul Kagame, are exceptions. Most of the time, what we need in Africa is good enough governance, because government that is really committed to development is by exception. What provides good enough governance? Electoral democracy is the best guarantor, so that you have a that you have a new leadership coming through and a system that brings new blood to the top. That is why over long-term horizons, democracy is proved superior to any other system. If you have a 1,000-year history like China, it's a different issue. And you have the traditions and the practices that develop. So, the second thing we need in Africa is evidence-based policies, not ideological-based policies. In South Africa, we very often make the cynical remark that for the ANC, the governing party, what works in theory or in ideology is what holds, and not in practice, not based on evidence. We need policies that are based on evidence, and this is where our work plays quite a role, I think. It's an effort to try and bring evidence to the table. Evidence and good enough governance. It's what I think is our best bet at developmentally led leadership. We have modeled leapfrogging. I go to themes, so we try, imperfectly so, to look at what is the impact that leapfrogging can have on Africa. Now, we tend to get excited about artificial intelligence, about robotics, and all of these things. The reality is that 400 million Africans more don't have electricity. You cannot leapfrog if you don't have electricity, first. And you cannot leapfrog if you don't have internet, second. Those, in our view, are the prerequisites for leapfrogging. And you can get those prerequisites through modern technology, through decentralized off-grid renewables, and through satellite and other internet systems. But unless you do that, you cannot really leapfrog Africa. Yes, Nairobi and Cape Town, Lagos will do well. But those are two prerequisites. So in our theme on leapfrogging, we look at how leapfrogging has unlocked the shale and tight oil revolution in the United States. It changed geopolitics, and it made Africa irrelevant to an extent, because the US was importing a large amount of oil from Nigeria in particular, and to a lesser extent Angola. The US is now the largest producer of oil and gas. It's energy insufficient. It doesn't need the Middle East, but China does need the Middle East. Then we look at the potential of renewable energy in Africa, which is huge. We look at what has happened with mobile phones and broadband, particularly in Kenya, and what has happened, how that has unlocked particularly mobile finance through fintech. And we think that modern technology, the most important impact that widespread adoption of internet and mobile telephony and so on can have, is that it will more rapidly formalize the informal sector. Because what it does, it lowers the barriers of entry to companies in the private sector. And it is eventually the private sector and innovation that will drive development. And then we model this. And here is the scenario that we use. Like I showed you how we modeled governance, this is how we modeled the potential of leapfrogging and infrastructure. We've combined the two. Will unlock more rapid economic growth. And then we say, how does that compare by 2043 to the other 8 sectors that we have modeled? And those other 8 sectors, as you may remember, are issues around demographics, agriculture, health and wash, education. And we compare how these sectors, what return on investment, GDP per capita, reductions in extreme poverty will you get for these sectors over the same time period. So for example, we all know that education lifts all boats, but education takes a long, long time. It takes a generation to really get a return on education. So leapfrogging can make a difference, but remember that what I've said. The prerequisites for leapfrogging in Africa is electricity access and it is internet access. If you're talking of leapfrogging of the average African, not the people that are sitting in this room. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I've answered the 3 questions.
Thank you very much. Any final? Okay. Can we have any reflections from you, Dr. Cyril, in 2 minutes?
Well, I didn't get any question. But for me, it probably means several things. One of the things that African decision makers, scholars, and activists need to remember is that in this world, sometimes things are not what they seem to be. And we must ask very critical questions. In looking at the conjuncture that we find ourselves as Africans, Africa has challenges and opportunities. I like the comment on Africa needing the US, EU, and China. I equally like the comment that EU, US, and China need Africa. But the question is, what is Africa's strategic vision for engaging a rapidly changing world? And that is not a question that we can answer outside of the conversations that we need to have with African people. There is a lot that we can imagine, but the reality is that Africa has to be united. A lot of the time when people speak about Africa, it's really the geographical expression. But let's look into our politics. Let's look into our economics. Let's look into issues of justice, equity, and inequality. Somebody spoke about climate security. Why not talk about climate justice, for example? The example of 630 billion and 19.5 billion is a clear case of injustice. But what can Africa do about it? What are Africans doing about it? What are African governing elites doing about it? These are questions we need to ask. And if we don't answer these hard questions, then we will be more reactive than proactive. And my sense is that a lot of what is happening in terms of what is happening within our countries, in terms of what is happening at the continental level, is basically reactive. Until we change the structure within our societies and we restructure the marginalized positioning of Africa in the world, we really may not be able to begin to address issues of sustainable peace. I noticed that a lot of the discussion did not talk about sustainable peace. It's more about development. It's more about the big ideas. But the big ideas have to be rooted in the people. And we must, as scholars and activists, begin to think of how to do things differently to achieve better results in the emerging world that poses both challenges as well as opportunities for Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To you, Dr. Seals, your final reflection.
I'll make 2 remarks. The first is that just simply pointing to a relationship between peace and development. The countries that are stable are rich countries. Countries that are unstable are poor countries. The relationship between instability and poverty is huge. It's not because poor people are violent. It is largely because in poor countries, governments don't have the capacity to provide security. There's a lot there that one can unpack. The second point really relates to the issue of African coherence and policy. Africa is divided on almost everything. We like to speak about African positions, but the reality is that the continent, different countries have very vastly different positions. I make that because I think there are two things that we should be looking towards going forward. Where we need coherence on, and I mentioned that in my the final slide, is we need to start by working on agreement on technical standards for stuff like railway lines and imports and transparency on debt. Forget about the big politics, because we are not going to agree. First point. Second point is what the biggest advantage that our membership of the G20 is going to bring is that it's going to force a degree of coherence on some of those bigger issues. Because to prepare for a G20 meeting, I was in Europe last week, and the Germans were telling us there are 200 meetings to prepare for the G20 every year. 200. Who in the Africa Union is going to, how are we going to do that? We don't even have a budget for it. In any case, but membership of the G20 is going to force a degree of policy coherence on other foreign policy issues. But I say again, what we should be looking at is really issues around agreements on technical stuff, around implementation, on practical things that the continent needs. Thanks very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much to our panelists and to you, the audience, for being very active and alert to the issues that have been shared. The challenge rests on us, because we are the academia, we know we have a lot of knowledge, and with the models and analysis as shared here, we need to be able to make them simpler, share the issues, change the narrative that Africa is in control of herself and they are tired of poor governance. Thank you very much. Have a good evening. I'll now hand over to our hosts for any final remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this public session. We've now come to a close of this conference, but I do want to say a special thank you again to all our speakers and participants and everyone that engaged in the conversations. I think we started off today with the address that challenged us to look at the wicked problems, that reminded us that we shouldn't be afraid to ask the hard questions and tackle those stubborn things that are the key challenges that we need to address to get to the change that we want to see. I think this morning we were also challenged, as in a room full of academics, how do you translate the work that you do to make it easily digestible for those in the policy-making space? That was a challenge that was put out this morning. And as we went through the different sessions, thinking about the challenges to democracy and peace building, I think there were a lot of key recommendations and key pieces of food for thought that came through. Our hope is that as we go through the remaining 2 days of the conference, that we will have the opportunity to even unpack them further and really think through key actionable steps that we can put forward and we can continue to work on together as members of this network. So once again, I want to say thank you to everyone, and please have a wonderful evening.